In March of 1982, a social worker was sent into the wooded hollows of Shannon County, Missouri. She found a cabin leaning against itself, its windows clouded, its porch sagging into the soil. Inside stood a gaunt man, a woman with lowered eyes, and 3 children whose faces repeated so precisely they seemed copied rather than born. Their names appeared in no ledger. Their mother could not be found in any record. Their bodies carried scars and marks that silence alone could not explain. The cabin offered no answers, only stillness. Yet every document examined, every trace uncovered, pointed back to the same family line closing in upon itself. What could force a household to erase its own existence from the record? And why did an entire community choose to turn away rather than speak of what they saw? Before we go any further, I want to ask you, where are you watching from, and what hour is it over there right now? Leave your answer in the comments below, and while you are here with us, make sure you subscribe to X Archives. The road into Shannon County's hollow narrowed until it was little more than ruts in the soil. At its end stood the cabin, leaning, weathered, and waiting, as if it had been abandoned years before. The first signs of spring were still hesitant, the ground soft from thaw, the air carrying the musk of wet wood and damp soil. Into this hollow drove a junior social worker on state assignment, her tires spitting mud as the narrow track opened into a clearing. At its center stood a cabin that looked older than memory, leaning under its own weight, its boards silvered with age and its windows dulled by a film of dust so thick they appeared frosted. There was no mailbox, no fence, no smoke curling from the chimney, only the sound of a crow settling on the skeletal branch of a sycamore, its cry cutting through the stillness. The structure looked as if it had resisted change for decades. The porch sagged on its joists, creaking when the social worker's boot pressed against it. Around the clearing the trees gathered in close, branches knitted overhead. The silence of the woods disturbed only by that single crow. It was a silence that weighed, not the natural quiet of isolation, but something heavier, as if the air itself was guarding what lay inside. The door opened with a groan. A man appeared first. Elijah Shelton. His frame was gaunt, his beard streaked with gray, though he was not yet old, his eyes pale and fixed with a kind of weary intelligence that did not soften even in greeting. He stood as though braced against intrusion, one hand on the frame, shoulders squared as if the cabin behind him required his defense. Behind him, a woman stepped into view. Martha Shelton. Her posture was smaller, shoulders drawn in, gaze lowered to the ground. She did not speak. Her presence was shadow-like, quiet, and entirely without resistance, an echo to his severity. And then, in the narrow gap of the doorway, the children appeared. 3 of them, their hair a washed-out blonde, their eyes a hard, unnatural blue, their faces cut with the same sharp lines as the adults who stood before them. They watched in silence, their expressions flat and unreadable, as though each were a mirror of the other. Their resemblance was so striking that it unsettled, each face almost identical, each gesture too familiar. They were not simply siblings, they seemed like copies produced from the same mold. The air of the cabin spilled outward, oil smoke, damp wood, something metallic underneath. Behind the children, the outlines of a life lived far from the world could be seen, lamps instead of bulbs, a stove blackened from years of wood, chairs worn smooth by use. There was no hum of electricity, no glint of running water. The place bore the texture of another century, as though time itself had halted once Harold and Edith Shelton, the parents of these 2 remaining adults, had built the house decades before. The social worker stood in that doorway, her case file still tucked under her arm, and realized that nothing inside the hollow would fit neatly into the forms she carried. There was a pattern already emerging, in the silence of the man, in the lowered eyes of the woman, in the faces of the children, too alike to ignore. The silence in that hollow was not the quiet of poverty, but of something buried. The first place it would show itself was not in the cabin, but in the missing lines of the ledgers where names should have been written. The courthouse in Shannon County was no grand structure, only a brick building with pale plaster walls and a faint scent of mildew carried up from its basement records room. It was here that the first attempt to place the Shelton children into the order of law began. Clerks pulled ledgers down from their shelves, their fingers leaving pale streaks through the film of dust. The pages rasped softly as they were turned, one after another, until it became clear that what should have been there was missing. The search began with the simplest question: the children's births. The clerks consulted the county register, then the adjoining townships, then the state index. Each book was the same, handwritten entries in faded ink, every line a name followed by the date, the mother, the father, the doctor who had been present. But nowhere in the years between 1970 and 1977 did the names Thomas, Sudie, or Jacob Shelton appear. Their years of birth were accounted for, yet the space where their lives should have been inscribed was bare. The same silence appeared in the vaccination logs, where each infant in the county was recorded for routine visits. Whole columns of names, dates, signatures of traveling nurses, all intact except for the gaps that should have contained the Shelton children. It was as though they had been passed over deliberately, erased from a system designed to leave no one untouched. School rolls offered no better answer. Each autumn, teachers submitted neat lists of pupils, the attendance sheets inked and checked. Yet across 3 school districts, not one bore the name of a Shelton child. Not one suggested they had ever been enrolled or even considered. They had grown as though planted in soil rather than born into law, nurtured by the family alone, untouched by the outer world. The social worker recorded this absence carefully in her file. Legal remedies were limited. A child with no birth certificate could not be formally placed in protective custody without prolonged hearings. A student with no school record could not be proven truant. The erasure did not only make them invisible, it also built a shield around the very people who sought to keep them hidden. Bureaucracy itself became their shelter. Those who handled the ledgers were unsettled in ways they did not fully admit. The empty lines did not feel like neglect, but like intention. It was as if every document had been combed through, names crossed out before they were ever written. The omission grew louder with every page turned, until it seemed to speak for itself. These children had been deliberately erased from the life of the county. The investigator left the courthouse with more questions than when she entered. Poverty had been expected, secrecy suspected, but not the absolute absence of identity. A child without a record is a shadow, and shadows leave no legal trace. The children breathed, spoke, and moved through the hollow, yet in the ledgers they had never been born. If the state could not name them, then only the woman inside that cabin could explain why they existed at all. Inside the Shelton cabin, the silence was not divided equally. Elijah's presence carried authority, but it was Martha who bore the weight of the children. Her posture was small, her hands folded close to her body, her eyes lowered to the ground as if the floor itself commanded her attention. She did not speak when spoken to. She moved only when Elijah moved, following at the edge of his shadow. Yet when the children shifted or cried, it was toward her that they turned. Thomas, the eldest, clung to the hem of her skirt. When Elijah's voice sharpened, Sudie, with her clouded eye, pressed against her side, like a child returning to the womb. Jacob, the youngest, climbed into her lap whenever she sat, curling against her chest in a way no aunt could inspire. They sought her scent, her arms, her heartbeat. She never resisted, never scolded. She absorbed them like water soaks into cloth, silently, steadily, as though she had been born into that role. The cabin's air carried the evidence plainly. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. The tilt of the children's ears, the sharp lines of their cheekbones, the pale, almost translucent eyes, all mirrored Martha's own face. To look at her was to see them in miniature. To look at them was to glimpse her younger self multiplied 3 times. In a household that refused words, features spoke more clearly than any testimony. Small domestic acts revealed more than any statement Elijah ever made. Martha prepared their food with mechanical regularity, portioning dried beans and cornmeal into bowls carved by hand. She bent to tie frayed shoestrings, lifted cups to lips too small to hold them, smoothed back hair with the same gesture their mother might have used had she been alive. Yet when asked, Elijah insisted the children's mother had died years ago, leaving no photograph, no grave, no name. Martha stood silent at his side, her eyes still fixed on the ground. The investigator noted the way Jacob's hands clutched at Martha's dress whenever Elijah spoke. She recorded the detail of Thomas's posture, protective yet deferential when Martha entered a room. She described how Sudi's broken gaze softened only when Martha placed a palm against her cheek. These were not the instincts of children raised by an aunt. They were the primal attachments of offspring to the woman who had carried them into life. Martha's silence deepened the unease. It was not ignorance but refusal, a learned habit of erasing herself in front of outsiders. Each time she looked downward, it was as though she were folding away the truth with her own body. Her stillness told more than words could have. Her silence named nothing, but her face was echoed in the children's. If Martha was their mother, then the question left hanging in the cabin's stale air was worse than any omission. Who, then, had fathered them? The first answers could be read not in words, but in the marks carried on their bodies. The children carried their history not in words, but in the visible record of their bodies. The eldest boy, Thomas, bore the most obvious mark, a deep, jagged scar that ran along the length of his forearm. It was said to have come from an axe slip the year before, when he had been sent to split wood far too large for his frame. No stitches had been laid, no proper dressing applied. The wound had closed as the body willed it to, leaving a pale ridge puckered and twisted, a reminder of how the family's hardships were not treated, only endured. Sudi, 9 years old, tilted her head when she tried to look at the investigator. One eye squinted against the light, the other drifting outward, clouded by an untreated condition that blurred her sight. It was not just poor hygiene or neglect that had left her in this state. Her teeth crowded unnaturally, her jawline showing the strain of growth denied balance. She rubbed at her face as if to push the defect away, but it remained, written into her features as permanently as her pale hair. The youngest, Jacob, had scarcely begun to speak. At 5, his words should have formed into phrases, his sentences stumbling into coherence. Instead, he clung to Martha's dress, his sounds still half-babbled, his mind caught behind a wall no one could yet name. His body lagged as well. He still wore cloth diapers sewn by hand, his small frame fragile, movements hesitant and delayed. He was not starving, none of them were, but he seemed stunted, held back in a way that food alone could not explain. Together, the 3 children presented a picture that could not be dismissed as ordinary hardship. Malnutrition explained part of it, but not all. Their features repeated too closely, their defects clustered too neatly. Each bore an anomaly, and together they formed a pattern. In the cool light of clinical observation, the investigator began to recognize signs not only of neglect, but of bloodlines that had folded too tightly inward. The cabin held no records of their injuries, no medicines for their ailments. Each mark, each delay, each irregularity had been left to heal, or fester, on its own. Poverty might excuse the lack of care, but it did not explain why the same pale eyes, the same crooked teeth, the same narrow foreheads recurred across them all. Their resemblance was too precise to be mistaken, too exact to be coincidence. The notes written that evening in the case file spoke plainly. Children show evidence of long-term neglect, physical injuries untreated, developmental delays observed, possible hereditary factors indicated. The phrasing was careful, restrained, but behind the words lay unease. Poverty leaves bruises, hunger leaves ribs, but these children carried something else, a set of traits passed from one body to the next, like a torch handed in darkness. The questions came, as they had to. How had the scar gone unstitched? Why had the girl's sight never been tested or corrected? Why had the boy's tongue remained so quiet? Yet, when these questions were put to the family, there was no answer. There was only stillness, the kind of silence that felt older than the children themselves. Scars spoke where mouths refused. They suggested a pattern, a slow inheritance written in blood. And when questions about these marks were asked aloud, the reply that returned was not words at all. but silence made into law. Questions inside the cabin met with the same reply again and again. Nothing. The silence was not clumsy or nervous, not the hesitation of people unsure what to say. It had the weight of practice. Elijah received the inquiries with eyes fixed but lips unmoving, as if he were rehearsing stillness. Martha lowered her gaze, her hands tightening against the fabric of her skirt. The children copied what they had seen every day of their lives, watchful, mute, waiting for silence itself to pass for speech. To outsiders, the absence of reply was unsettling. A question about the children's mother produced no detail, no hesitation, not even the pretense of invention. Elijah offered a name once. She died years ago, and nothing more. No description of her appearance, no memory of her illness, no record of her grave. The explanation fell into the room like a stone dropped into water, and when no ripple followed, the silence resumed its place. Martha's silence was the heaviest of all. She seemed less a participant than a shadow, an outline pressed into place by someone else's command. Her quiet was not shy or accidental. It was bound to her like a garment. When asked about her care for the children, her lips remained shut, her gaze fixed on the floorboards, as though the wood itself demanded her loyalty. The stillness in her presence carried the gravity of law. The children mirrored what they saw. When a question was put to Thomas, the eldest, his lips parted as though to answer, but Elijah's glance stopped him. He pressed them shut again, the lesson too deeply ingrained to break. Sudi, with her ruined eye, shifted behind Martha when her name was spoken, clutching the fabric of her dress. Jacob pressed his face into her lap and made no sound at all. It was not natural for children to remain voiceless in the presence of strangers, but in this house, silence had been taught as survival. The investigator's notes reflected not just what was missing, but the way it was missing. The stillness did not spring from fear of punishment, though fear was present. It was older, ingrained, as though handed down like an inheritance. Silence here was not absence. It was a weapon, a shield, a code. Every unanswered question tightened the suspicion that what was being protected could not be spoken aloud without collapsing the household entirely. The case file marked it plainly. Silence ritualized, repeated by all members. No detail provided on maternity. Pattern appears deliberate. The phrasing was dry, clinical. Yet even in those spare words, the truth was pressing at the edges. This silence was the strongest defense the family had. Stronger than locks, stronger than threats. It was the tradition of not speaking what had been written into their lives long before the investigators' arrival. The silence was not ignorance. It was protection. But protection of what, and from whom? To answer that, investigators would have to look backward to the parents who had built the cabin and written these rules into their children's lives. Long before Elijah and Martha stood in the doorway of the leaning cabin, their lives had been shaped by the beliefs of the two figures who built it. Harold and Edith Shelton were cousins by birth and husband and wife by choice. Their union, whispered about even in the tolerant quiet of Shannon County, was defended by Harold as loyalty to blood. To him, marriage outside the family meant dilution, weakness, the loss of something he called purity. In those words lay the foundation of the doctrine that would outlive him. In the 1920s, Harold raised the cabin from timber cut on his own land. Its frame was square, its roof pitched against rain, but it was built less as a home than as a boundary. The woods around it grew thick, and Harold did nothing to thin them. He wanted a fortress, a place where the outside world could be kept at a distance. The town was near enough for supply runs, yet far enough that the children could be raised without influence. The structure's rough boards and narrow windows were a statement as much as shelter. Here we keep to ourselves. Here the world ends. Edith followed his lead in silence. She bore Elijah first, then Martha, and raised them according to Harold's design. School was dismissed as poison. The county register noted their enrollment briefly in the early 1940s, but attendance stopped before Elijah turned 9. God's word is enough, Harold told those who asked, and after that, no teacher saw them again. From then on, their education came from handwritten booklets Edith copied by lamplight, filled with scripture, maxims, and Harold's own words about the dangers of outsiders. By the 1950s, the Sheltons no longer came to town with regularity. Supplies were bought only when necessary, and then always with cash. Harold preached in his own house, not in a church. He was remembered for phrases he repeated often. "You don't mix fine blood with such swamp water." To the neighbors, it sounded like eccentricity, backwards thinking best left alone. But to Elijah and Martha, it was law. Their father's voice defined the limits of truth. Their mother's silence confirmed it. The years passed under this closed order. The cabin became both fortress and prison, its walls thick with doctrines that repeated as insistently as the wind through the hollow. By the time Elijah turned 30, his world had narrowed into a belief that only family could be trusted, and only blood could preserve them. Martha, 4 years younger, learned to obey rather than question. Their lives were circled tight, cut off not by accident, but by deliberate design. Then came the fire of 1973. Its cause was never proven. Some whispered of an accident with the stove, others of arson. But by morning, Harold and Edith were gone. The cabin smoldered, its timbers charred but still standing. And within those blackened walls, only Elijah and Martha remained. Yet the doctrine survived them. It had already been written into their children's minds, passed down not in books or sermons but in years of silence and isolation. The fire had ended 2 lives, but not their doctrine. What Harold and Edith had written into their children did not burn with them. It lived on, and in the years that followed, the town itself would choose to look away. The Shelton cabin did not stand so deep in the woods that no one ever saw it. Neighbors passed by on their way to fish the river or cut timber, and some recalled glimpses of Martha in the yard, her figure swollen with pregnancy. Yet when eyes lingered too long, Elijah appeared at the threshold, a shotgun resting across his arms. His stare was enough to drive people back down the path. In Shannon County, men who guarded their homes were left undisturbed. No one pushed further. In the small store near Birch Tree, clerks remembered seeing Elijah and Martha arrive together for supplies. He paid in cash, buying sacks of flour, beans, kerosene, and cloth. The children were never with them. What unsettled the clerks was not what was present, but what was missing. When the children finally did appear years later, their faces bore uncanny resemblance to Martha's, a resemblance so sharp that quiet speculation began to circle. Still, no one spoke it aloud. In this county, silence was its own kind of law. Families kept to themselves, and questions were considered trespass. A neighbor might note the strange sameness of the Shelton children's features, but he would not take that thought to the sheriff. A store clerk might feel a shiver of suspicion, but she would never put it into writing. The unwritten code was simple. If a household raised its walls high, others pretended not to see. This culture of silence did not merely overlook, it enabled. Each opportunity to intervene, each moment when doubt stirred, was smothered by the belief that family matters belonged behind closed doors. Outsiders were considered intrusions, and even the state, when it knocked, was met with polite resistance. The county became complicit not by ignorance, but by inaction. The few who did speak of it years later admitted their unease. One farmer remembered seeing Martha fetch water from the creek, her hand as resting protectively on her belly. Another recalled the unnatural stillness of the children when they appeared in town. Yet each had turned away, telling themselves it was not their place. Fear played its part, but so did habit. Silence was the easier choice. The effect was that the Shelton children grew up in plain sight, yet invisible, their very existence erased not only in ledgers but in the minds of their neighbors. To speak of what they saw would have forced others to share responsibility. To remain silent meant leaving the burden with the family alone. That silence, repeated across years, ensured the erasure held. The town's silence was not ignorance, but consent, a decision to leave the Shelton family untouched. Yet scraps of their truth had already surfaced, in hospital records under false names, waiting for someone to see the pattern. The courthouse had produced silence, but the hospital archives told another story. In the basement of the county hospital, investigators turned to metal drawers lined with index cards and thick ledgers, their pages heavy with dust. The smell of antiseptic lingered faintly, a ghost of decades past. Clerks pulled records from the years 1970, 1973, and 1977, years that coincided too neatly with the ages of the Shelton children. On each occasion, a woman had been admitted under a false name. In 1970, it was Mary Ellis, listed as 20 years old, admitted for complications late in pregnancy. In 1973, the name was Anna Bell, admitted 2 towns over, again carrying a child. In 1977, Sarah Morton appeared briefly on the rolls before vanishing just as suddenly. None of these names could be traced to women who lived in the county, nor could follow-up visits be found. The handwriting on the forms was hurried, sometimes mismatched, as if someone had spoken the names without conviction. The alignment was too precise to ignore. The ages of the Shelton children matched the years of these admissions almost exactly. Each child's life, absent from courthouse records, appeared instead as a faint trace in hospital logs, disguised beneath the flimsy cover of aliases. Martha's presence was implied, but never named outright. Her body had been accounted for in symptoms and vital signs, yet her identity was erased. Investigators noted how each record ended abruptly. The entries stopped after delivery, no notes of discharge or follow-up care. The mothers, if they were real, disappeared. The children, if they were born in those rooms, left no formal footprint. The paper trail resembled a wound half-stitched, visible only if one looked closely enough to see what had been concealed. The concealment itself spoke volumes. It was not the accidental neglect of a county overwhelmed by poverty. It was an intentional effort to evade detection. To arrive under a false name required forethought, a willingness to risk exposure in order to keep the truth sealed inside the hollow. The state's systems, built to account for every life, had been bent around the family's silence. The hospital clerks could not recall the faces, but they remembered the manner. A woman accompanied by a gaunt man, their eyes lowered, their words sparse. Payment was made in cash, never insurance. They came at night or in the early hours of morning, stayed just long enough for the labor, and were gone before questions could mount. The files told the story, the cabin never would. 3 children, 3 vanished names, 1 woman erased from the record each time. The ledger lines, faint but undeniable, confirmed what the courthouse had failed to show. What Elijah and Martha would not confess in words was preserved in ink and paper. The ledgers told a story that the cabin would never confess. 3 children, 3 vanished names, 1 woman who could not be accounted for. But the pattern was older still, a web of blood stretching back through the family itself. In the quiet offices of the County Historical Society, where maps curled at the edges and filing cabinets groaned with brittle papers, a historian pieced together the longer story of the Shelton line. He explained that in the hills and hollows of the Ozarks, cousin marriages had once been common, born less of doctrine than of geography. Settlements were small, distances wide, and kin were often the only choices within reach. What began as circumstance, however, hardened in the Shelton family into creed. The records he traced showed patterns repeating. Marriage licenses from the 1880s, 1900s, and 1920s bore the same surnames folded against one another. Sheltons and distant Sheltons, Sheltons and cousins by another name. Each generation pulled the circle tighter, leaving fewer lines outward. The family that began as one among many in Shannon County grew inward, bending upon itself until it became something apart. For Harold Shelton, father to Elijah and Martha, these marriages were not necessity, but faith. He preached that pure blood was sacred, that outsiders diluted strength, that kin united was kin preserved. He told neighbors that deformities were not curses, but proof that their blood was strong enough to resist corruption. His words carried no pulpit beyond the cabin, but to his children they were law. His wife Edith stood beside him silently, her life a confirmation of his creed. The historian laid his finger along the ledgers, tracing how Harold's words had bound his family to a practice that others abandoned long before. In nearby towns, cousin marriages faded by the mid-century, but in the Hollow, the doctrine remained, passed from Harold's mouth into Elijah's ear, spoken as obligation, not choice. To step outside, it would have been to betray the family entirely. Elijah absorbed this inheritance with the same severity his father had carried. He kept the cabin closed to strangers, refused contact with schools, barred visits from preachers. He spoke of outsiders as threats and of Martha not only as sister but as guardian of the line. What to others appeared monstrous, to Elijah was duty. Each similarity among the children's faces, each repeated feature, was to him a mark of loyalty, a confirmation that the doctrine held. The historian's account did not come with judgment, only unease. In his telling, the Sheltons' choices were not aberrations of impulse, but the product of decades of narrowing belief. To outsiders, the children's anomalies were warnings of something gone wrong. To Elijah, they were emblems of faithfulness. Patterns in ink, scars on flesh, silence in speech, each pointed to the same truth. The Shelton family's web of blood was not accidental. It was constructed, defended, and passed down deliberately. For Elijah, keeping blood unbroken was not sin, but duty. To outsiders, it was unthinkable, but to the family, it was inheritance. The first written warnings of this inheritance had been set down years earlier in a reverend's quiet journal. The first warnings about the Shelton family did not come from officials or clerks, but from a man who carried a Bible in his satchel and a notebook in his coat pocket. Reverend Samuel Miller traveled the rural counties in the late 1960s and early 1970s, visiting homes too remote for regular churches. His notes, preserved in a small cloth-bound journal, told of the cabin in the hollow before it hardened fully into silence. Miller recorded his first visit in 1969. He wrote of Elijah, already a grown man, standing in the doorway as if guarding the interior. Martha appeared beside him, her eyes hollow, her words strange. The Reverend noticed at once how her sentences sounded rehearsed, as though learned by rote. He pressed gently, asking about her health, and she replied only in phrases Elijah allowed. The stillness of her posture unsettled him more than her silence. By 1971, Miller noted a change. Martha's figure was altered, her dress drawn tight over her belly. He suspected pregnancy, but received no answer when he asked. Elijah cut short the conversation, his hand tightening around the barrel of a shotgun that leaned against the doorframe. The Reverend withdrew, but not before recording what he saw in his journal. The woman carries child, her eyes do not rise, the man forbids her speech. Concerned, Miller carried his observations to the sheriff's office. He was told the family was private, that nothing unlawful had been proven, and that such households were best left alone. His warnings were set aside with polite dismissal. One official told him plainly, "They've never troubled us. Don't trouble them." Still, Miller returned once more in 1973. Smoke from the fire that consumed Harold and Edith still clung to the air. Elijah now stood as head of the house. Martha, again with child, appeared thinner, her face pale. When the Reverend urged her to speak alone, Elijah stepped forward, hand resting on the shotgun. His threat was not spoken in words but carried in posture. The Reverend retreated, writing that he feared for her but could not stay. His final entry on the matter read, "They live behind law of silence. My words are unwelcome." Years later, when investigators pieced together the fragments of evidence, Miller's journal surfaced from a drawer in a church office. Its ink had faded, but its warnings remained clear. Martha pregnant in 1971, Elijah hostile to interference, silence drawn like a curtain around the family. The words had been written when something might have been done, yet no one had acted. The journal became an artifact of neglect, not the families alone, but the communities. It showed that someone had seen, had recorded, had tried to raise alarm. It also showed how easily those alarms were ignored. The Reverend's words lay forgotten in a drawer, a prophecy dismissed. The child Martha carried was born into silence, and a decade later, sickness in the youngest would bring that silence to a hospital bed. It began with a collapse. Jacob, the youngest Shelton child, was found on the cabin floor in early spring, his body trembling with fever so fierce that even Elijah could not deny the need for help. The ride to the hospital was made under protest, Elijah insisting at every step that the boy would recover at home. But when the child's breath rattled thinly in his chest, the family's silence could no longer hold. The hospital was a world the Sheltons had kept at bay for decades. Fluorescent lights hummed with unnatural brightness. Corridors carried the smell of antiseptic and the echo of hurried steps. Martha clutched Jacob against her chest as they entered, her dress damp with sweat from his heat. Elijah walked behind, shoulders rigid, his eyes darting at every face as if each glance were an intrusion. Jacob was placed in a narrow bed, white sheets drawn up against his frail body. Electrodes and thermometers replaced the family's crude cloths and herbal teas. The contrast was startling. A child from another century laid beneath the hum of modern machines. His skin was pale, his frame smaller than his years, his words still tangled in half-speech. Nurses exchanged quiet looks as they charted his weight, his delayed milestones, the anomalies too plain to ignore. Doctors examined him closely. They noted the shape of his skull, narrow and uneven. They recorded his jaw, underdeveloped and crowded with teeth. They remarked on his speech delay, his frailty, his susceptibility to fever. These were not the marks of neglect alone. They belonged to inheritance, to bloodlines closed in on themselves. What the community had whispered for years, medicine now gave language to. The child bore the signs of sibling-level inbreeding. Elijah's resistance sharpened under the glare of hospital light. He refused to answer questions about the boy's mother. He demanded the child be released. Yet the charts were already written, the samples already drawn. Jacob's body carried evidence stronger than silence, and for a brief moment, it was preserved beyond the walls of the cabin. Martha sat at the bedside, her hand moving across Jacob's damp forehead. For the first time, she looked directly at the investigators who stood at the doorway. Her eyes did not lower. They held resignation, a recognition that what had been hidden for years was now being pried open by fever and by science. She whispered words too faint to be entered into record, but her posture spoke enough. She could not protect the silence any longer. The boy's fever eventually broke under treatment, but the silence could not be restored. What his body revealed had been noted, measured, charted, and logged. It would not vanish like the names in the courthouse ledgers. In the thin hospital light, fever loosened the first threads of silence. The child's body carried marks that poverty could not explain, and the answers were now being read not in words but in blood. The hospital room was quiet except for the hum of machinery and the faint hiss of oxygen. Jacob lay beneath white sheets, his fever breaking in the sterile light. At his bedside sat Martha Shelton, her shoulders hunched, her hands folded over her lap. For years she had answered nothing, her silence thicker than walls, but now her lips parted. Her words came haltingly, each one forced from a place long suppressed. She spoke of the fire that had taken Harold and Edith in 1973, leaving only her and Elijah within the cabin. She described the weight of their father's doctrine, repeated until it became the only law she knew. The family must remain whole. That phrase, she whispered, had been spoken by Elijah again and again, reshaped into command. It was not a suggestion, not even persuasion. It was decree. Martha did not frame her story as confession. It was resignation, her voice stripped of defiance. She said that Elijah had taken control the moment their parents died, insisting that outside influence was corruption, that to marry beyond the family was betrayal. He told her she was chosen, the guardian of their line, and that her duty was not to herself, but to blood. In the silence of the cabin, she had no ground on which to resist. Her words fell unevenly, fragments of a life under command. She did not describe choices. She described survival. She remembered the children arriving one after another, each carried beneath Elijah's doctrine, each born into secrecy. She spoke of the fear that followed every pregnancy, the false names given at hospitals, the return to the hollow where no neighbor dared intervene. The investigator recorded her statements carefully, noting not only what she said but how she said it. There was no energy of rebellion in her voice, only exhaustion. Each word was spoken as if to finally set down a burden carried too long. She did not accuse Elijah directly. She did not call herself a victim, yet her resignation revealed captivity deeper than chains, psychological, generational, unbroken since their father's time. The silence that had defined her life did not shatter, it cracked only in places. Between her sentences lay long pauses, stretches of wordless air where memory could not pass into language. It was as though even now she sought permission before speaking, even in the absence of Elijah's command. Her whisper was testimony, but not full confession. It revealed the framework of coercion, the doctrine of isolation, the obedience hammered into her since childhood. It showed the shape of captivity, but left the rest to be proven elsewhere. Her voice broke the silence, but only in fragments, enough to show that Elijah's rule was more than choice, it was command. The rest would not come from her mouth, but from the science that measured the marrow itself. What had long been whispered, suspected, and half-written in ledgers now arrived in the form of typed reports. The state ordered DNA testing after Jacob's hospitalization, the samples drawn with quiet efficiency, a vial of blood from the boy, swabs from his siblings, records taken from Elijah and Martha. For decades the family had relied on silence as their shield, but silence carried no weight in the laboratory. The work unfolded under fluorescent lights, not in courtrooms or cabins, but in sterile rooms filled with the hum of machines. Samples were labeled, processed, run through sequencers. There was no room for speculation, no space for doubt. Patterns repeated themselves in the cold logic of alleles and markers, rendering what the eye had always suspected into numerical fact. Weeks later, the reports arrived. The pages were typed, the formatting standard, the language clinical, yet their content carried the weight of a verdict. Elijah Shelton was identified not only as guardian, not only as brother, but as father to all 3 children. Martha, his sister, was confirmed as their mother. Where silence had once obscured, print now revealed. The children's resemblance was no longer suspicion, it was certainty, etched in blood. The file was entered into evidence, stamped, dated, archived. The truth that had hovered like rumor now existed in binding form. For investigators who had followed the trail through missing ledgers, false hospital names, and whispered testimony, the reports carried no surprise. They were less revelation than confirmation, the inevitable end of a path already drawn. But for the state, for the court, for the record, they were everything. The precision of the documents was striking. Each line matched child to parent with percentages, the language of probability reduced to near absolute. Paternity index 99.9%. Maternity confirmed. There was no left for denial. The case file that once consisted of silence and unease now held its core in black and white certainty. Elijah did not read the documents, but he felt their weight in the questions that followed. The defense he had relied on for years, silence, denial, the absence of proof, collapsed the moment the reports were entered. Martha, already broken by resignation, sat without response as her name was inscribed beside her children's. The family's silence, once their strongest weapon, had been translated into evidence too heavy to erase. Investigators remarked afterward that the moment carried little drama. No sudden gasp, no revelation shouted across a courtroom. Only the flat shuffle of paper, the cold tone of a clerk reading aloud, the click of a stamp. It was not spectacle, but record, and in that record the years of concealment dissolved. The reports, once filed, became more than documents. They were mirrors, forcing the state, the county, and the family itself to confront what could no longer be unspoken. The silence that had guarded the cabin for decades was now bound into record, each line of the report a mirror that could not be turned away. The next stage would not be private. It would unfold beneath the courthouse roof. The courthouse in Shannon County was small, its wooden benches polished by decades of use. In the summer of 1984, they filled to capacity. Farmers left their fields, clerks their offices, drawn not by curiosity alone but by a need to witness the reckoning of a family whose silence had once been their own. The air inside was heavy, the ceiling fans slow and ineffectual, the murmur of voices subdued. At the front sat Elijah Shelton. He was gaunt but unbent, his eyes fixed forward, his hands resting on the table as if carved from the same wood. To his right, the public defender spoke of inheritance, not of land or wealth, but of belief. He argued that Elijah was shaped by his father Harold's doctrine, raised in isolation, convinced that blood must remain pure. He was, the attorney said, a product of circumstance, molded by the laws of the cabin rather than the laws of the state. The prosecutor answered in steady tones, turning pages of the DNA reports, pointing to the testimony of physicians, reading aloud the words written in Reverend Miller's faded journal. Belief, he insisted, did not erase harm. Doctrine, however ingrained, did not excuse the wounds carried by children. The state had no interest in Harold's ghost. It sought to reckon with the living. The spectators shifted uneasily. Some remembered turning away when they had seen Martha, heavy with child. Others recalled the uncanny sameness of the children's faces in town. Their silence, once justified by fear or custom, now felt complicit beneath the light of evidence. Martha was brought forward to give deposition. She did not raise her voice. She barely raised her eyes. Her account was one of captivity, not of partnership. She described the fire that had ended their parents' lives, the years that followed when Elijah repeated his father's creed, the absence of choice, the absence of freedom. Her words were halting, yet they carried the weight of survival. The court saw not an accomplice but a woman who had borne children beneath command, her silence less consent than resignation. The jury listened with lowered eyes, their expressions grave. When the trial closed, there was no outburst, no spectacle. The verdict was read in the same muted tones as the evidence: guilty. The conviction was not accompanied by fury, only by an acknowledgement of what had been proven and what could not be undone. Elijah was sentenced, though debates about leniency lingered. His defenders insisted that he had been born into a prison before he built one himself. The state, however, marked the harm, not the excuses. For Shannon County, the trial was more than a sentence. It was a mirror, reflecting years of silence that had allowed a family to vanish in plain sight. The townspeople left the courthouse not with relief, but with unease, as though a shadow had been named but not lifted. The verdict was delivered in whispers, but its weight fell on those who had once been children in the hollow. Their story would not end with a sentence. It would continue in the lives they were forced to rebuild. When the trial ended, the children were not returned to the hollow. They were carried instead into foster care, where their lives unfolded in a world they had never known. For the first time, they entered houses lit by bulbs that hummed overhead instead of lantern flame. They touched running water drawn from faucets, not the creek. Their eyes widened at schools filled with rows of desks, blackboards, and teachers calling their names aloud, names that, until then, had never been written into any public record. The transition was slow and not without difficulty. Thomas resisted at first, clinging to the codes of silence learned in the cabin, answering questions with lowered eyes. Sudie struggled with her ruined sight, unsettled by the noise of classrooms, her posture shrinking beneath the gaze of peers. Jacob, youngest, spoke haltingly, his words broken, but each syllable was a step toward a language denied him for years. For the first time, they were recognized, accounted for, and given futures not dictated by blood alone. Martha's path was slower. Removed from Elijah's command, she remained in the care of state workers, her silence lingering like a second skin. Therapists described her as compliant but haunted, her words faltering, her identity fractured between sister, mother, and survivor. Recovery did not come in sudden revelation, but in hesitant steps. Her first unguarded sentence, her first moment meeting another's eyes, the slow realization that she could speak without permission. The county filed reports, stamped and archived, each page a record of what had been erased for decades. Ledgers that once bore empty lines were now filled with names, dates, and testimony. Trial transcripts, medical files, and hospital logs became the language by which the state reclaimed what silence had stolen. Yet these documents, however orderly, could not dissolve the unease that remained. Back in the hollow, the cabin stood for a time, abandoned, its windows broken, its roof sagging further each year. Weeds crept across the porch. Vines wound their way up the walls. Rain soaked through the timbers until they softened and split. Locals avoided the clearing, some claiming the air there still carried the weight of secrecy. Hunters and passers-by noted its ruin in whispers, pointing to it as a symbol of what silence had built and destroyed. The children grew beyond it, carrying scars invisible to the eye. Martha, too, lived on, neither fully free nor entirely captive, her life now a record of what generational doctrines could shape and what silence could conceal. The hollow remained behind them, but its shadow persisted in memory and in archive, a warning preserved for those who would later seek its traces. The cabin rotted into the ground, its silence swallowed by vines, but the story it carried did not die there. It endures as a warning written in absence, in silence, and in the price of blood kept too close. If you wish to hear more accounts like this one, mark this record with a like, and subscribe so the next will not be lost to time.